Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. So I was realizing I know a few people in this room from my own faculty, so this may be a surprise because I haven't presented this in the faculty except for when I lecture. So, right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about desirable difficulties, but I'm going to set that up with a few bits of research. This is the rough plan for today. And that is to start by talking a little bit about what the research from cognitive science says about the best learning techniques. And this is probably very student-centered rather than lecture-centered. And link that to what we know about the things that influence remembering stuff and forgetting stuff. And then finally pulling that all together with this idea of desirable difficulties and the research that happens in this area. So I'm going to walk you through a really large study, and this is tiny because I've nicked this from the specific study. Don't worry about having to see the text from where you are. And I have given the citation at the end of the slide so you can read the whole study if you'd like to, as well as actually a short introduction paper that is a nice summary of it. So what John Dunlosky and colleagues did for this paper that was published in early 2013 is they reviewed a large body of evidence looking at the different things that learners might do and how that might affect how well they show learning in a variety of metrics. And so they identified 10 kind of key learning strategies, learning techniques that learners might use when they're preparing for some sort of evaluation. Shorthand, I'll say some kind of test or assessment, but it's a kind of a wider remit than that. And so those 10 strategies are elaborative interrogation, which I'll talk a little bit about what each of those are, self-explanation, summarization, highlighting, underlining, keyword mnemonic, imagery for text, rereading, practice testing, distributed practice, and interleaved practice. So a kind of rough guide to those 10. Elaboration is being able to generate some kind of explanation for the validity or accuracy of information that you're trying to learn. Self-explanation is trying to explain how new information is related to old information. Summarization is just writing a summary of the information that has to be learned. Highlighting is really just highlighting, making the page colorful. A keyword mnemonic is developing kind of a keyword or mental imagery to try to associate with various kinds of materials. Imagery for text is kind of forming mental images of text material. Rereading is literally only that, just going back and rereading something. Practice testing is having low or no stakes practice tests, so you're basically just trying to recall information. Distributed practice is doing a little bit often, so rather than one big study session, it's doing shorter study sessions across time. And interleave practice is mixing things up. So what I'd like you to do at your tables is answer two questions. Which of these 10 strategies do you think students do most? And which of these 10 strategies do you think might be very effective? There are some that are more effective than others, so we'll just get a sense of what do you think students do and what do you think is actually effective in terms of their learning. Okay, so if we start with the table at my right, what do you think, we'll start with what do you think students do most often, and then what do you think might be one of the more effective things that we could do in learning?
We think they reread and highlight most often.
And what do you think is most effective? Or, so, one of the more effective ones?
The top two, I think, probably.
Elaboration and self-explanation. Okay? Middle group? No, this is why this big study is important.
So for a science student, I think nowadays they get handouts, so they'd be doing a lot of 4 in the lecture and then probably rereading after the rep.
So again, highlighting and rereading.
And a lot of my students do mind maps, so 6 and then for revision and preparing for exams, a bit of 5 and 8.
So a bit of keyword and a bit of practice testing. Okay, good.
We also had rereading and highlighting.
Yeah, okay, so you know your students well, I think, in this room. This is good.
But effective, I wonder if practice testing is actually one of the more effective ones.
Why do you think it's more effective?
I think it depends on the exam, but if you have a set amount of knowledge, then the people can only test that in a certain number of ways. And so if you're going over the questions, not only are you familiarising yourself with what you do and don't know, but it probably matches on to the course quite well.
Okay.
If you have access to the past papers.
That's good.
And then we'd also go with 2 and 3.
So 2 is self-explanation and 3 is summarisation. Okay, good. And the last table at my left.
We also thought highlighting is probably what goes on a lot. And post-it notes, similar. Creating summaries in different contexts, maybe flashcards, and also nowadays copy and pasting into Word documents from reading.
Okay. And what do you think is effective?
We thought writing summaries probably can be quite effective if you're actually engaging with the material properly, and self-explanation.
Okay. Right. Why do you think those are? We had some other groups, and I didn't ask. Why do you think?
I disagree with everyone in the room and think 9 and 10 are the best ways of.
Well, we'll wait till we get. You can disagree, and we'll wait till we see the evidence as well. But yes, so that's quite good. So, why do you think summarization and self-explanation are useful?
I think self-explanation is useful because often students can do a problem but might not necessarily understand how they've actually done it, and if they can explain to themselves how they've done it, then they can often apply the knowledge elsewhere rather than just in a very specific context which they've learned the steps for. And relating old information to new information is a very constructive way of teaching or thinking about it.
Okay. All right, so before I show you a little bit more, I forgot to highlight something at the very beginning, and this is my little graphic to kind of give you a sense of where my research is embedded. So this is kind of, this blue bubble is teaching, kind of thinking about teaching, the yellow is psychology, and the purple is kind of a cognitive neuroscience. So a lot of what I do in terms of science of learning is integrating all 3 of those approaches. And when Meg mentioned you've talked about behaviorism and constructivism, probably the research that I talk about today fits into a 3rd category, which I think in a lot of kind of science of learning contexts would be kind of information processing. So how are we actually making sense of all the information that comes at us in the world? Okay, so a little bit of a context about one of the things that the researchers were really interested in. So these 10 learning techniques, and they looked through the literature to evaluate how well these techniques work across a wide range of contexts. So they weren't just interested in a technique that might work in one very specific context, and it may be really effective. They don't want to deny that that might be really effective in a specific context. But what they wanted to think about was identifying learning techniques that are universally effective, that work across the board. So it could be something that could be encouraged regardless of the subject area. Fully aware that there may be certain things or certain contexts where different learning techniques might be better. So they have a large number of things like the materials that were to be learned, the different kinds of learning conditions, the different student characteristics, and the different, they called it criterion tasks, but it's kind of the different ways that learning was assessed. And this is their example of the various things. Again, you don't have to worry about all of those, but it's just trying to show that they were interested in learning from a broad perspective rather than thinking about it in a very specific situation, without denying that in specific situations some things might be more effective. Okay, so this is the last really horrible table from their, in small text from their paper. This is their evaluation of, oh, sorry, I'm supposed to stay in my little box. This is their evaluation of these 10 learning strategies. The column to focus on at the moment is the utility column. There are 2 that are rated as high, and that is practice testing and interleaved learning. They have the highest utility of any of the learning strategies. There are a few that are actually low, and the lowest, which doesn't actually show up in this table, are the things that students do the most of. highlighting, and rereading. There are a few that are in kind of the moderate category, so elaborative interrogation, self-explanation, and, oh, sorry, I misdid that. High is distributed practice, and interleaved practice is moderate. So distributed is doing a little bit often rather than cramming right before you have to do it. Sorry, I've got the glare, and so I can't quite see the bottom bit. They've also were quite honest, which is the bit on the right, which I won't focus on the areas where there's not enough information. And the specifically, when you look at the different kinds of ways that they evaluated these strategies, which ones are kind of easy to implement, which is this issue here. Some are really easy and some are harder. That makes a difference in terms of how much students might be engaged, but also where there's still a lot of room in terms of evidence that we don't have yet. So there are some of these strategies where there's probably a lot of room for more research to actually figure out how well they work universally. But I think the key that I kind of boil this down to are two key things to kind of be thinking about in terms of what is facilitating learning. And the first one is inputting less and generating more. Rereading and highlighting is all about receiving information. And that doesn't actually help us very much in terms of actually learning it. We have to engage with it and generate stuff with information to learn it. Just getting it in, receiving it doesn't guarantee anything. And it's why, in many ways, the lecture is kind of the worst learning situation. Lectures, I think, have a purpose. That part of it might be, my view is it's introducing people to some ideas, getting them excited about stuff. But in terms of learning, lectures are the worst context for learning, because a lecture is all about giving information to the people who are sitting in the room. And it's generating stuff that facilitates learning. So at Cambridge, we have this kind of really nice complementary system that we've had for a long time before cognitive scientists were around trying to explore these ideas. And that is, we have a lecture which might, inspire people, get them thinking about ideas, and then we have supervision. And supervisions are all about generating. Students have to do something to prepare for supervisions. So we already have this really nice inbuilt system of trying to generate information in terms of student learning. And how that information is generated does differ across subjects in terms of, are they solving problems, are they writing essays, a variety of different methods that people who work in those areas feel are important in terms of the skills that students need to build up. The second one, which is the distributed practice idea, is a little bit often, and that is, it's a lot better to do a little bit every day or every other day than trying to do a bunch of stuff in one session. And that's true kind of across the board. So instead of doing all day on one subject in terms of revision, it's actually better for us as learners to split up the day into the different subjects that we might be preparing for, let's say for exams, and do a little bit every day on each of those subjects. So the reason why these sorts of strategies are better than the other strategies like rereading and highlighting is largely because our intuition, and quite oftentimes students' intuition, is that memories work like a video recording. We have, great access to being able to record everything, and that is brilliant for having precise evidence of what actually happened in a setting. But we know from a variety of just things that happen in everyday life that our memories of what happened in those settings are far from perfect. Our memory does not work like that kind of perfect video recording. And so what is happening in terms of the things that students use, like rereading and highlighting, is it's kind of creating this false sense of familiarity with material and a false sense of actually knowing something, when actually they haven't actually engaged in stuff enough to remember it accurately. And part of that is because the way that memory tends to work is by making connections between the things we know and the things we're about to learn. And I have some terms on here that are much more kind of psychology terms, but it's kind of the way we seem to be organizing a lot of our memories fall into various kinds of concepts about, We have concepts for cups and animals and various sorts of things like that. We have schemas about how the world works. And we're using that information to kind of, when new information comes in, we're more likely to remember it if we can make connections to the things we already know. And so that is the kind of the key thing to learning. Well, the way that you make those connections is not just by getting that information in really, really fast, but by slowing down and engaging with that information. So a couple of things to kind of back that up in terms of what's happening with memory is just to give you a little bit of context of kind of how cognitive scientists might conceptualize remembering and forgetting. So there are different kinds of ways that we might build up memories. One of them is encoding, and that's usually kind of with sensory information, so stuff that's kind of coming at us through our senses, visual, auditory, sometimes haptic, through touch. And that is kind of taking in that information, and when we engage with it, it kind of creates not usually, this isn't the longest term memory, but it creates kind of a memory of things that happen. And this is why it's quite oftentimes, if we hear a song from our youth, it will also evoke other memories of the things that we might have been doing around the time that that song was popular. So we've kind of, encoding is kind of linking that sensory information to other things that are happening in our lives. Rehearsal is that kind of repeated practice. So this is something that you might think in terms of people are learning musical pieces. They have to rehearse it and do it over and over again to learn it. And elaborating is kind of creating and filling in details. This is something that we do a lot with our memory, and this is what gets us into trouble. So we quite oftentimes form memories based on our past experiences around how things should work. And so when we don't quite have all the details in our memory, what we tend to do is fill it in with how things should probably have worked. And so we do a lot of that in terms of our memory. And what can happen over time is because we filled in these details of how things should work, is that over time our memories can become actually not necessarily the kind of the truth and the accuracy of what had happened. And this is generally kind of a limit in terms of our cognitive system, but this becomes important in terms of helping students learn, because to do things that they're going to be using for the longer term, they've got to embed it in memory. It has to be something that they can remember and retrieve and talk about. So remembering also kind of has to fight a little bit against forgetting, because that's something that also happens. So there are a couple of things that kind of matter in terms of forgetting, and one is that things just kind of slowly decay over time. But the other one is that any new information that we're getting always has to compete with old information. So if you're teaching something to students or you're introducing a concept that's really complicated, and it might actually not necessarily agree with some other things that they might have learned because you're taking them to the next level in a field, that is going to be really hard for students to learn, because that new stuff has to compete with the old stuff that they already know. And so in any kind of learning, there's that kind of push and pull between the things that they have reinforced over time and the new things that we're teaching them, and especially when those new things kind of go against the stuff that they've practiced over and over again. So this is another example. This is quite an old model. This would be what psychologists would call an information processing model. It comes from Atkinson and Schifrin, and it goes all the way back to the 60s. And this is basically kind of when information is coming in and the various points at which we can lose that information. So if we're in a lecture situation, we probably have some sensory input, and that might get, if it's not attended to, it will get lost completely. So for example, if you're walking down the road, since there's a road there, cars are going by us all the time, but we're probably not paying any attention to those cars unless we have to cross the road, or if a very unusual car drives by. And so if you walk down the road and I ask you to tell me at the end of walking down the road how many cars you saw, most of us would only be guessing, because that information, although it's coming at us all the time when we're walking, it's not something that we're actually engaging with and processing. And that's something that happens quite a lot in a lecture situation, because different individuals may be kind of attending to various kinds of information that may be happening in that situation. And we know from research on attention is that we do have a finite capacity. We can attend to stuff for a little while, but then we need a break. And so what's probably happening in a 1-hour lecture is that various students are coming on and offline in terms of attention at different times. So if we attend to something, then it goes into our short-term memory. If it's not rehearsed, then it's lost. So let's say a student's really engaged in a lecture situation, but if they don't actually go back and rethink about it, this is where supervision is really good because it's creating that rehearsal situation, then it's lost. Then the next bit is it moves into long-term memory, can be lost over time, but the key bit is this act of retrieving information, which is what practice testing makes us do, makes it more likely that we're going to remember that information in the future. So a practice test works in many of the ways that you were talking about, but one of the other key bits is that just by having to remember something means it's the next time you have to remember it, you are going to remember it more, you're more likely to remember it. And so even if learners get many things wrong on a practice test, they will do better the next time just because there are a number of things that they've remembered once that they'll remember again. So I try to tell my students it doesn't matter how many things you get right on a practice test, it's that you're doing it, because that is what's helping you build up memory over time. This is just a little comic that I put in, which is, it's almost 11 o'clock. Wow, the last 2 hours really flew by. I hope the teacher didn't say anything important, which is kind of that whole idea of attention being a really key part to engaging and learning something over the long term. So kind of giving you that really quick crash course on kind of memory and learning from a cognitive perspective, I'm going to come now finally to this idea of desirable difficulties. So the most effective learning strategies fall into this camp. Desirable difficulties is a term that Robert Bjork introduced in the early 90s. And the idea is that sometimes learning, the best learning, goes against our natural intuitions. And this is what, when you talked about the things you think students are doing, which is their natural intuitions of the things that are going to work, just keep going back to it, repeat it, do it over and over again, aren't necessarily the things that really help us. And that sometimes we have to do things that slow down our learning to kind of make it better. The other piece around desirable difficulties, which is linked to the appeal of something like highlighting and rereading, is that a low-level cognitive process, which is that kind of increasing familiarity, which I mentioned earlier, is actually really rewarding. So when we come to a task and it feels familiar, from a learning perspective, that feels kind of nice, and so we keep going back and doing it over and over again, but it can bias our awareness of how much we actually know. Where something like practice testing gives us pretty clear evidence of what we know and what we have yet to be able to recall, kind of regularly. And so sometimes the situations that kind of lead to faster improvement initially actually don't help us in the long run. And so the idea was that slowing down learning helps us in the long run, but it takes a bit of awareness of that, okay, it's going to be really slow at the beginning to have payoff at the end. Now, I'm going to highlight a little bit more later with some other evidence about the key to this isn't about difficulty, it's about desirable. Being difficult can be different for different students in different settings, and it's not just about making things more difficult. It's about putting things in a context that facilitate learning where learners are at the given stage that they're at. Okay, so I'm going to give Bob a chance to tell you a little bit about desirable difficulties. He talks kind of quietly, so you'll have to be quiet because we have it as loud as we can.
Well, in terms of the sort of unintuitive aspects of how human learning and memory works, and the fact that there are this set of conditions that make people improve very rapidly, making conditions predictable, constant cues, massing practice. There's a whole variety that make people improve very rapidly. Well, the converse of those things is if you introduce variability, if you introduce spacing, if you use tests rather than restudy trials as learning, if you interleave the separate things to be learned, those all slow down the apparent learning, but under most circumstances help long-term retention and help transfer of knowledge, what you learn, to new situations. So those things, variability, spacing, using tests rather than presentations, interleaving, sometimes reducing feedback to the learner, those things in a chapter I labeled years ago as desirable difficulties. They're desirable because they enhance long-term retention and transfer. They're difficulties because they pose challenges. They slow down the rate your own performance is improving as a student. And a consequence of that is they can be easily unappreciated. Students can be unhappy with you as a teacher if you introduce some of these things, because their own performance will improve more slowly. Or put the other side of it, if you do these things that make performance improve very rapidly, but then don't support long-term learning, learners could be quite happy with that. Who doesn't want to make rapid progress or apparent rapid progress? So this poses sort of a challenge, namely, it requires doing some things that are unintuitive and sort of unappealing, and requires instructors and learners alike to sort of have a different view. They need to keep their eye on what's the long-term goal of learning and not what the immediate consequences are for performance or a sense of fluency or ease. So the implications are quite dramatic. As I sometimes talking to teachers say, just look at our own course syllabi. We work hard to structure them, make them organized, but one thing we do then is we cover a given topic in a block. We might give a test on it, and then we move to something else. If you really, if as a teacher you say, what are the half dozen concepts and ideas that are just crucial, that I want people to remember a year or longer afterwards? Those things have to come up multiple times. You have to induce the things where people will produce those rather than you present them. They need to be hooked up and related to other key items on all the way that you can. I mean, if that's your goal, that the real key things from this be part of the learner's repertoire to carry on to their own real-world activities, to subsequent courses, they have to not be just covered and dropped. They have to come up in varied circumstances with varied contexts. They have to be produced by the learner. They have to be related to all the different things they're related to. And if you approach it from that standpoint, a course will have a quite different structure. You may get students feeling, well, we've been over that already. Why are we coming back to it? Or what's the answer? Why are you asking me? I'm the student here. Why are you, if you don't know, you're supposed to know. Why are you asking me? And there's many dimensions to this, but when teachers ask questions in a class, they have to shape the class into saying that they're not going to keep, instructors just not going to keep going unless somebody tries to answer that.
So I'm going to pause there. There's only about 30 seconds left because I want to give an example of something Bob talked a little bit about and something I mentioned, which is this idea of desirable being quite important. And he talked about an idea called fluency. So I'm going to give you some additional evidence to kind of think a little bit about this general idea of some of these strategies are not necessarily something students will find intuitive, and that it is not just about making it harder for them, but it's also probably thinking a little bit about how to get them on board, which I'll talk about after fluency, but also how it can be fine-grained based on what students already know. So the idea of fluency is that we can do something quite quickly and quite readily, so we use it terms like being fluent in another language. I'm going to give you an example of a place where we might create disfluency from a very old psychology task. And this involves a bit of audience participation. So this is the Stroop effect, which some of you might know. So the idea is I'm going to show you some words, and I want you to, as fast as you can, say the color of the word. Ready? Go.
Green, red, blue, purple, blue.
So the screen's not the best. It's kind of hidden, but you did a very good job. Now I have another list, and I want you to tell me the color of the words on this list.
Red, green, blue, red, purple.
So that was harder. And part of the reason why that's harder is because we're very fluent readers. And so when we see text, our usual thing is to read it rather than to identify the color. So although these two lists are kind of equally fluent in terms of reading, naming the colors, one of them is a little bit more difficult than another. So I'm going to talk about this idea of disfluency in terms of something that can slow down learners and get them a little bit more engaged with information. So a friend and colleague of mine, Danny Oppenheimer, and his then PhD student at Alter, did a number of studies looking at disfluency. And what they basically did is they disrupted the ease at which something could be read by using difficult-to-read fonts. And they tested this in a variety of different contexts. So they did problem solving, they did memory, they did a variety of different kinds of things like history, science explanations. So they've done this across the board. And they've done some work they did all their work in the US. A vast majority of the research was conducted on university undergraduates, but they've done some work in high schools, so equivalent to kind of sixth form in the UK. And they've been able to replicate this finding. So they've had quite a lot of success in terms of this general idea of making text more difficult to read, slows down readers, and the learning outcomes are better. But Valerie Thompson, who works at I believe, the University of Saskatchewan when she did this work, wasn't able to purely replicate the finding. So she was really interested in this finding, and she designed an experiment to kind of build on it, and it didn't work. And so she thought, well, I should maybe try to replicate it. Maybe there's a problem, maybe I'm not doing something right, so she tried to replicate it. Still didn't work. So she started to think a lot about the research that Danny had conducted, and all of his university-level research projects had involved students from Ivy League institutions. So he did his PhD at Stanford, and then he was at Princeton, where a lot of this work occurred. And so she thought, well, maybe the students at Princeton are a little bit different from the students at the University of Saskatchewan. So she did kind of just a general cognitive skills assessment. And she split the students up into the top 25%, the bottom 25%, and then kind of the middle 50. And what she found was that the original finding of slowing down learners worked for the top 25%. For the middle group, it didn't really matter if it was easy to read font or hard to read font. But for the lower group, the group at the bottom 25%, the difficult to read font made the task much more challenging for them, and their performance went down. So the idea behind this is that just making something difficult is not necessarily the answer. It's thinking about who are the students and are they ready for it. So if students have different kinds of educational needs, then slowing down learning might actually be really bad because their learning might already be difficult. But for people who process information really fast, slowing them down is having they're spending a bit more time on the task. It's kind of creating kind of that more attention on the task, and that is helping with learning. So it's kind of thinking about this desirable does depend a bit on who the students are. It's not just about making it universally harder for everybody. that same phenomena goes to one more example, which I think is something we might care about in terms of lecture contexts, and that's whether or not students should be taking notes in lectures by hand or with laptops. And it's the same sort of thing. So what happens when students have laptops is they can type really fast, and quite oftentimes they can type almost every word that is said by the lecturer. But if they're doing notes by hand, they're actually having to engage a bit more in the information and decide right there and then what's important. What do I need to remember later? And so this is also work by Danny in a different context, where he had a variety of different situations. He's done multiple experiments on this, where it is actually more effective in terms of student learning to be taking notes by hand rather than notes by laptop. An example might be a court stenographer who gets every single word in court proceedings, but if you ask them at the end of the day what happened, they have very little memory of what happened because they're not actually processing the information. It's kind of just coming through quite automatically. But this would not apply for a student who might have any sort of special educational needs that might make it difficult for them to write, because they're already having the difficulty in terms of writing. So this is the kind of thinking about the sorts of things that might strategically help a student in terms of slowing down learning, but not slowing down learning for students who already have kind of too much going on that they're having to deal with in terms of learning situations. Okay, the last thing I'm going to do before questions is show you some really useful practical stuff. So I hope I've introduced you to some ideas and some ways of thinking and maybe some things to kind of get students involved in that might be helpful in terms of their learning. But thinking about that from a very practical, how does this work in everyday settings, is not necessarily part of this presentation. But some colleagues have developed in the last couple of years this amazing website. It's called thelearningscientist.org. And they have all sorts of resources related to the most effective learning strategies. So they have the ones that were kind of ranked as the highest strategies on the Dunlosky paper. And they have specific examples for how teachers and lecturers might implement these kinds of strategies in their everyday practice and how students might implement the strategies. They've also just released a book which is really great called Understanding How We Learn. And it kind of takes the science of learning into kind of the everyday. This is for everybody, regardless of what you know about learning, to help people understand the limitations of the memory system and how we can boost it. These are some of the examples that they've got up in terms of the key strategies with various kinds of tips for, okay, how can you implement this in a regular revision session, that sort of thing. They also have another joint site of somebody who partnered with them with resources for kind of lecturing situations, teaching situations. I think it's a little bit more geared to pre-university, this particular one. I'm going to show you very briefly, not all of the video, but they have this video that I've been trying to get all of my students to watch, which is really kind of about the most effective learning strategies.
6 essential strategies.
And I will show you the first one, but I won't do all 6 because that takes too long.
If you're a student, you've probably wondered, what is the most effective way to study? That's a smart question because most people, unfortunately, waste their time with stuff that just isn't effective. So I asked the cognitive psychologists over at The Learning Scientists for some tips. After all their research into the science of learning and absolute best practice study skills, here are their top 6 strategies to bring out your inner genius. The first strategy is called spaced practice. 5 hours of study crammed into one intensive session is not as good as that same 5 hours spread out over 2 weeks. You'll learn more and get better results with the same amount of time or less. It'll be less stressful than the panic of cramming, and because you'll learn more, you'll also reduce the time you need to study in the future because you won't have to relearn the same information. Make a plan and schedule short study sessions into your calendar. This is not about marathon intensive periods of study. Review information from each class starting a day later. After you've covered the most recent class, go back and study important older information to keep it fresh. And don't just reread your notes, that's ineffective. Use the other strategies in this video. and leave 2 to 3 days between study sessions on the same subject. The key is consistent, short study sessions over time.
Okay, so that moves on to the next one. I've got another bit, which is some stuff by Jonathan Firth, which is kind of also bringing together some of these same ideas. He did a blog this last year in the spring, a week until exam, what's the best way to revise, and then what to do with 24 hours. So there's a lot of kind of cognitive science work kind of coming through. He's also got a book called How to Learn, which is based on cognitive science practices. So my last thing I will mention before questions is to say that one of the issues with a lot of this research is it's very embedded in kind of the cognitive element and not kind of the socio-emotional aspect of learning, which all of us know is really important. And the last video kind of talked a lot about anxiety. And I have a doctoral student who's also a head teacher who's working on this question with their students, and that is looking at how if you are preparing students with these sorts of study skills, does that help reduce anxiety over high-stakes testing? They're not very far into the project. They did some pilot work with one small classroom last year, and the students who did it reported quite a lot of reduced levels of anxiety compared to before. But this year is the main study year, so this is a to-be-answered question, and I think this is something really that is really important in terms of implementation, is thinking about, does this actually help with the anxiety piece?
Is that actually desirable? Because if you think about Yerkes kind of Dodson curve of anxiety performance, for some people that would be brilliant, but for other people you actually might reduce their performance by reducing their anxiety.
Yeah, and so in her context, so she works in an independent school with 11 plus exams and has, for her, the parents and the kids are incredibly anxious. So her levels of anxiety as a head teacher are really high. But I think you're right. There is, as you know, a sweet spot in terms of anxiety. You need a little bit to be motivated and to prepare for the exam. But it's that avoiding those high levels of anxiety, which are things that I think the counseling center would tell us. We've got a lot of students who are struggling with that. And so that it's finding that space, just like the desirable piece is finding out, well, where is that going to be most helpful for students in terms of that not having enough to be motivated is that kind of right space. But being too anxious shuts people off.
It'd be hard to incorporate into your study, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to Michelle, the school.